Shalom. I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel Report. In this week's report, we're going to be sharing with you regarding the current status of the conflict between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And it is as follows. Hamas leader Khaled Mashal confessed that Hamas militants were behind the kidnapping and killing of 3 Israeli teenagers in the Hebron area in June. He said, "Our view is that soldiers and settlers on the West Bank are aggressors, and they are illegally living in this occupied and stolen land, and the right to resist is the right of the Palestinians." This was the beginning of the summer conflict between Hamas in the Gaza Strip and Israel, which escalated when Hamas started launching rockets at Israel on July the 8th. Furthermore, Jibril Rahuba, a senior Palestinian Authority official, said that the Palestinians have made a political decision to support Arab terrorists slaughtering Jews living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. He said, "Our political decision is resistance in the occupied territories in order to bring an end to the occupation, using all forms of resistance," he said. Also, Fatah's military wing, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, announced a full return to terrorism, declaring open war on Israel. This position is consistent with the Palestinian Liberation Organization's Charter of 1968, which calls for armed struggle and armed revolution against Israel, declaring armed struggle is the only way to liberate Palestine and calling on local Arabs to be prepared for the armed struggle. So far, Hamas has fired over 3,000 rockets from the Gaza Strip into Israel. For this reason, Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to fight Hamas and other Gaza terror groups until Israel was safe from the threat of missile attack. He said that the Israeli Defense Force campaign will continue until Israel is sure that its residents have quiet. He said that no terrorist target was off limits and accused Hamas's leaders and gunmen of hiding behind Gaza's residents, using them as human shields, and thus being responsible for any harm that comes to them. While Israel did everything to protect its citizens, he said, and has spent billions to protect the home front in recent years, Gaza's terror groups deliberately put Gazans in harm's way. Israel does its utmost not to harm Gaza's civilians while targeting the terrorists, whereas Hamas targets Israeli citizens, he said. Netanyahu said that he had made this point in conversation with a series of world leaders, including U.S. President Barack Obama and Russian President Vladimir Putin, and that all the world leaders with whom he spoke understood Israel's imperative to act. No state would allow its citizens to be targeted without a harsh response, he said. He also vowed that no international pressure will prevent us from acting with all force against the terrorist organization that seeks to destroy us, and that he would take whatever action was necessary to protect Israelis. He said that he had encountered lots of goodwill from world leaders and that he had asked them, "Would you tolerate missile attacks in London, Washington, Paris, Berlin, and Moscow?" Of course not. Netanyahu said that Israel was weighing all possibilities for expanding the campaign against Hamas in the Gaza, including the possibility of a major ground offensive. "We've prepared for all options. That's what I told the army to do, and it has done so. My uppermost consideration is to restore quiet to all of Israel's citizens and all of its cities. I will do whatever is necessary to achieve that goal. Beyond that, I cannot go into details. But at the same time, Israel had to ensure that we don't get another Gaza in the West Bank. Amid the current conflict," he elaborated, "I think the Israeli people understand now what I have always said, and that is there cannot be a situation under any agreement in which Israel relinquishes security control of the territory west of the Jordan River," a reference to the Jordan Valley in the West Bank, as U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry had urged during a U.S.-led peace effort that collapsed in April. Netanyahu said, "I told Kerry and U.S. General Allen, we live here. I live here. I know what we need to ensure the security of Israel's people." He said the current conflict also underlined the importance of retaining territory, noting that Hamas had tunneled relentlessly under Gaza's borders with both Egypt and Israel for smuggling purposes and for terrorist purposes. If Israel were to pull out of the West Bank like the world wants us to, there would be a possibility of thousands of tunnels being dug by terrorists to attack Israel, he said. There were 1,200 tunnels dug in a 14-kilometer stretch between Egypt and Gaza alone, which Egypt had sealed, Netanyahu said. Adjacent territory has huge importance, he said, and could be used by terrorists to dig tunnels and to fire rockets. The closer terrorists can get to Israel's borders, he said, the more rockets they can fire, as the current conflict is proving. At present, we have a problem with the territory called Gaza, Netanyahu said, but he noted that the West Bank is 20 times the size of Gaza, and vowed that he was not prepared to create another 20 Gazas in the West Bank. At the height of Operation Protective Edge, the Israeli army called up some 86,000 reservists to fight a ground war with Hamas in the Gaza. So far, Israel has agreed to a ceasefire with Hamas over 10 times. Egypt has been holding ceasefire talks with both sides. Recently, there was a 6-day ceasefire. After that, Hamas launched over 130 rockets into Israel over a 24-hour period. Later, Hamas launched nearly 170 rockets in a single day. The Gulf state of Qatar has been encouraging Hamas to continue its fight with Israel. Hamas leader Khaled Mashal has been living in Qatar since 2012. An official from the Palestinian Authority said that Qatar had no interest in seeing Egyptian-led talks succeed, and that Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood are working together to undermine the Egyptian efforts. In fact, Qatar threatened to expel Mashal if Hamas accepted an Egyptian peace proposal for a ceasefire. In their airstrikes in the Gaza Strip, Israel has been targeting terrorist leaders. In one instance, Israel killed an Islamic Jihad Brigade commander. At another time, Israel killed 2 very senior Hamas terrorists and 1 lower-ranking terrorist. With information obtained by the Shin Bet, that is the Israeli security agency, the Israeli Air Force fired missiles at a building in Rafah that housed Ra'ad Aider and Mohammed Abu Shamala, killing them both, security forces said. A third Hamas terrorist, Mohammed Barhoum, described by security sources as an abettor to the senior Hamas members, were also killed in the strike. This strike represents a very significant intelligence achievement and intelligence infiltration, a security source said. The attack came after the Shin Bet received intelligence on the location of the terrorists, security forces added, describing the targets as men who were senior and central members of Hamas's military wing. As a result, Hamas executed 18 Palestinians for allegedly collaborating with Israel during the Gaza war. The victims, their heads covered and hands tied, were shot dead by masked gunmen dressed in black in front of a crowd of worshippers outside a mosque after prayers. Near the scene of the execution, Hamas men attached a note serving as a general indictment for the collaborators. They provided the enemy with information about the whereabouts of fighters, tunnels of resistance, bombs, houses of fighters, and places of rockets, and the occupation bombarded these areas, killing a number of fighters. Therefore, the ruling of revolutionary justice was handed upon them. Nevertheless, Hamas officials remained defiant despite the assassination of 3 of the organization's top commanders. The Palestinian people have prepared themselves for hundreds of years to fight the enemy until the end, Hamas political chief Khaled Mashal said. We won't get tired of fighting after a month, a year, or many years. There will be no return to negotiations in Egypt before we have endured favorable circumstances that will force the enemy to meet the demands of the Palestinians. Mashal said that the Palestinians' top demand was the lifting of the Israeli blockade on the Gaza. Israel Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman was critical of Israel's willingness to discuss ceasefire terms with Hamas in Egypt. He said, "The government policy of calm will be met with calm is fundamentally wrong. It means that Hamas is the one that takes the initiative and the one that decides when, where, and how many rockets it fires on Israeli civilians, while we are making do with reacting. Even if our reaction is a strong one, it is still a reaction. Hamas has control over the intensity of the fighting, and it fires whenever it is convenient for it to interrupt the daily routine of Israeli civilians, particularly those living in southern Israel. We need to talk and negotiate with Hamas only when it has surrendered. We now must seek a quick and decisive end to Hamas. Israel must continue to fight Hamas until Hamas waves the white flag. Furthermore, Israel must aim for a complete demilitarization of the Gaza Strip. That means Hamas would have no capability to fire missiles at Israel, no capability to manufacture missiles, and no capability to build tunnels, Lieberman said. The proposals we have heard thus far, whereby there is no deal, no agreement, and no unequivocal commitment by the Palestinians to halt their fire, means that we are in for a war of attrition, which is something that the state of Israel cannot be dragged into. Naftali Bennett, the leader of the political party Jewish Home, said that when you want to defeat a terror organization, you reach a decisive victory. When we hold peace talks with a terror organization, we get more terror. Hamas thinks that rocket fire helps them reach their goals in talks, and so they fire even during a ceasefire. Rockets are not an accident as far as we're concerned. It's systematic. Bennett went on to say that only a severe response, like any sovereign nation responds to rocket fire on its territory, will be able to stop the deterioration of the situation. Sooner or later, Israel will need to subdue Hamas. There's no way to avoid it. Israel's finance minister, Yair Lapid, reiterated his position that Israel must not end Operation Protective Edge before ensuring the disarmament of the terror infrastructure in the Gaza and before the transfer of international funds to Gaza is monitored and supervised so Israel doesn't find itself in another round of hostilities soon. He said, any future arrangement must include the dismantling of Hamas terror infrastructure in the Gaza and complete control over the funds meant to rehabilitate the Gaza. For that to happen, I am promoting a regional conference to give a wide international cover for achieving these objectives. Without a diplomatic move, without wide international support, any attempt to reach an agreement will be the beginning of the countdown to another round of violence. Israel Housing Minister Uri Ariel said that we must strike the Hamas enemy until we achieve victory. It can't be that we'll be responsible for holding fire while they're responsible for firing. Israel Justice Minister Tzipi Livni said, the targeted killing of any person who deals in terror is not only legitimate but desirable in my eyes. Throughout these periods, I have always supported the targeted killing of terror leaders. Livni said she opposed the indirect negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians and Egypt. I do not negotiate with Hamas. I do not believe that they would agree to it, and I would not deal with them, but with international officials. She said, the fundamental question is whether the fire causes us to pay a higher price even when it ceases. In my eyes, that's a strategic question. We must not let them think that the fire leads Israel to pay up. We must continue to deter them, and only then will they understand that they cannot achieve more by using terror, that they are losing assets. Livni stressed that as long as Hamas does not fundamentally change its internal ideology, we are dealing with a terror organization. There is an ideological Islamic terror organization which does not recognize Israel's right to exist. I see the public is unified in the understanding of what needs to be done to solve this problem. In any event, after 50 days of intense hostilities, Israel and the Palestinians reached a framework agreement resembling the understandings reached after Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012. Assam al-Ahmed, head of the Palestinian Authority delegation in the Egyptian ceasefire, said that a long-term ceasefire was agreed upon between Hamas and Israel on August the 26th. Under the agreement, there will be an immediate easing of restrictions on the two main Gaza border crossings between Israel and the Gaza to allow in aid and reconstruction supplies. Well, that's going to conclude this week's report, where we shared with you regarding the current status of the conflict in the Gaza Strip between Hamas and Israel. Until we do it again, Shalom in Yeshua the Messiah. Amen.